Leslie Elliott is the co-founder of Solid Ground, a peer support community for ordinary people navigating extreme ideologies. Based outside Seattle, she also participates in a strong homeschooling community. During episode 23, we discussed how universities are sterilizing language and her experience of blowing the whistle on the hostile, unhealthy environment at Antioch University while she was in the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Master's Program. During this episode, we explore the psychology of dissident acts, what makes a person resist groupthink, and the qualities of modern-day dissidents. I ask Leslie, can anyone be a dissident, or does it take a particular type of person with certain personality traits? What combination of a certain time, place, and deep care or value could motivate someone to speak their conscience? I'm Sienna Heath, and this is Leaving the Left for Liberty. Well, Leslie, since our earlier episode on your experience of blowing the whistle at Antioch University, we've been wanting to explore a broader topic, and perhaps an even deeper one, which is the psychology of dissident acts, qualities of modern-day dissidents, perhaps things that we share, things that we maybe don't, or we're diversified on, and essentially what makes a person resist groupthink. Do you think that anyone can be a dissident, or does it take a particular type of person, perhaps a person with a certain personality type?
I think that's a really interesting question, and it's something that interests me quite a bit as well. I have not studied this formally. I'm sure there is a body of literature that has looked into conformity and personality and temperament characteristics that relate to conformity. I don't know if I think anybody could. I think that there probably are temperamental characteristics that predispose a person to being able to go their own way when they're presented with group dynamics that pressure them to conform in ways that they don't want to conform. Probably a variety of characteristics, including temperamental makeup as well as historical experiences.
I'm curious in particular for your perspective on this topic because, of course, as many of our viewers know, you studied clinical mental health at Antioch University before blowing the whistle on the unhealthy and hostile environment. How does your background in studying clinical mental health, psychology overall, and providing related forms of wellness care now inform your growing perspective on whether anyone can be a dissident or if there perhaps are patterns among dissidents in the modern day?
I think I've been interested in psychology since I took my first psychology course in high school. And I found it just really fascinating to look at the literature on human behavior. And then I studied it in undergrad. I did a research fellowship in undergrad and then took a break, went to law school, and then decided that law was not for me. So went back to graduate school and studied clinical mental health counseling, which is a form of applied psychology, but it's not this rigorous psychology education that you would get if you were going into sort of an academic research degree, if you were going to become a research psychologist or a professor. So I would say that my interest and my studies have informed my perspectives on human behavior to a great degree, but really my work over the last several years, I opened my practice in 2021. And since that time, I've had the opportunity to have a number of clients, quite a few different people that I've had the opportunity to get to know very well during that time. And I feel so enriched by that experience myself because it gives you sort of a perspective on, how many people can the average person know well in their lifetime. It's a finite number of people that we get to know very well. And so getting to work closely with people gives you an increased perspective of different viewpoints and the way people function in the world, the way that they interact with their reality. And I imagine that my perspective is just going to continue to grow. I'm sort of a baby learner at this point when it comes to understanding how people engage with conformity, really issues of groupthink and pressure. I had the opportunity to volunteer for Counterweight when Counterweight had a peer support arm. It was a wonderful group. There were a lot of people coming into that program looking for support because they were challenging authoritarian ideologies, usually at in the university or at work. And they were looking for support. Some people were concerned, but did not feel comfortable making a statement about that or pushing back against what they were experiencing. And some people were actively resisting the sorts of ideological pressures that they were facing. It was interesting to sort of observe what makes how people make that calculation for themselves. But not there are some people who say, well, I don't have as much to lose, so I'm going to push back. But that calculation is different for everybody. Some people feel that they have a lot to lose and they're really scared of losing their job. I mean, you can imagine a person who's providing for their family feeling like they're encountering this kind of pressure at work. And it's very scary to decide to. So I think that there are situational factors as well that play into a person's decision to actively resist.
Right, their circumstances play a role, but the individuals, almost like their trigger, what motivates them, I think is maybe even more crucial, because there are people with plenty to lose who still lost it, and spoke their conscience anyway, and spoke their conscience at times knowing that they probably would lose it. I think some maybe were more, I use this word, kindly, but naive. I would say I was naive too. It's like how rough people can be out there. But I rather than really focus much on like personality traits, I think while they might play a role, I think it's a combination of values and triggers, and perhaps the time, place, and deep care. My understanding from studying Matthias Desmet's work is that statistically, there's not a lot that one can point to, like with regards to patterns. It's not a type of person. It's not like over the span of history. It's actually an incredibly diverse group of people who will speak up. Whether it was during the Holocaust or some other time. And when you look at like the time, the place, and significantly the deep care that someone has for a certain value, or a certain quality, like transparency, like trust, like equality. Like for me, it was storytelling. Actually, it was like, well, why are some stories elevated and some stories not? I could rationalize and understand why that was happening, but essentially, like I just kind of couldn't sit and watch some stories not only be kind of just maybe pushed to the side a little bit, but just like completely shunned. It's like your story is invalid. Whereas some, they were just put up on this pedestal. And I found that to be a form of inequality that I just I couldn't even sometimes cope with. Like it just seemed so inherently wrong. Um, and when there is a certain time, place, and deep care for a certain value, even the most introverted personality types, interestingly, actually will break their silence and they will speak their conscience. And then if you look at personality traits, like, for example, charismatic personalities, I think in our society, we are inclined, or many are inclined, to listen to the charismatic types and even admire them. Like, wow, like they're so brave, or they're so powerful, or like, look how captivating they are. Whereas like maybe the quieter ones, it's not that they don't get as much attention or admiration across the board. For instance, Rosa Parks, she performed in a way, a quiet act of dissidence, but profound dissidence, and people cared and admired her eventually. But maybe actually there's something to that. Like, do people initially listen to and perhaps admire the charismatic types, the louder types, whether they're speaking or acting or both?
That's interesting. That is very interesting. I wonder, there are so many variables there. And you come back to values and a trigger is what you're calling it. And that's interesting. I think that you've really narrowed in on something important. And also, there's a bunch of other pieces that seem important, like these circumstantial things, like what makes someone get canceled. Sometimes the same thing that you might say in one setting and it seems pretty benign hits the wrong setting, hits the wrong ear, or somebody picks up on that wants to make an example out of you, and suddenly you're in a firestorm. And we've seen that happen time and again. And so then that that could be a trigger or a catalyst for some people to experience a lot of blowback that causes them to decide, either I'm going to stick to my guns and I'm going to reassert my position, or maybe I'm going to be cowed by this experience and I feel so intimidated that I'm going to back down and apologize and just try to make it go away, just try to make the stress stop. And so it seems like it would be a very difficult thing to really quantify. But what you're pointing out about different personality types, like the charismatic personality types, I think that that's fascinating. What makes a person charismatic in your eyes?
Oh, in my eyes, well, I'm very suspicious of charismatic types because at times those who exhibit narcissistic qualities will also be very charismatic. They captivate a room. They like to be the center of attention, and they're almost not like a full-fledged person, like a fully like energized unless they have that attention. Maybe that's a bit judgmental. I'm not saying all charismatic types are like that. But there are some that I'm often suspicious of. I tend to trust more, um, I suppose, quieter people or contemplative people or people who, yeah, just lean on the more introverted side. Although maybe introvert is not quite the way of putting it, but I would say charismatic people tend to have a lot of confidence, and they tend to be more extroverted. Other if they were charismatic, behind closed doors, maybe they're charismatic with their partners or their closest friends. But I don't know that I necessarily qualify them as like charismatic personalities if they're not taking that on a sort of stage. I think actually, the word stage reminds me of, one way I would phrase what we're talking about is the performance of dissident acts, the performance of dissidents. And when one is canceled, whether they mean to or not, they're suddenly on a stage. And I wonder if some people's perception of what's happening is that they're seeing a person who would otherwise not be charismatic or put themselves out there, put themselves on a stage, or be a performer of any sort, and they're saying, "Oh, well, like, look at all this attention this person's getting," or look at them like seeking out conflict where there was none. Where they're like actually in their day to day life the most unassuming person.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that I when you say charismatic, my mind goes to a few examples of people that I've known in my life. And there are certain people who just seem to really command attention and be really captivating, and you find yourself drawn to them. They're really interesting and bold. And yeah, that is it's an interesting distinction. I don't know how well that equates with dissident acts, except that perhaps it has something to do with being at the avant-garde, maybe somebody who's willing to take some social risks, um, perhaps engage in bolder action than someone who is more quiet and reserved and is going to wait and sort of take the temperature of a room and see how things shake out before they act. So maybe there is something there. It seems like risk-taking behavior in general could be correlated with voluntarily pushing back on something that is. It seems like the things that would make someone resist conformity would also line up with other personality factors that, like defiance, being a defiant person might be part of that. I know that that's definitely the case for me. Pushing back on things in general, being a skeptical person, there's a lot of factors.
I think it's also being comfortable with being outcasted and even to some degree kind of liking it and adopting it as a personality trait. It's like that. So like that embodiment of, the outcast of just, oh, I'm misunderstood, I don't fit in.
Maybe so. Yeah, maybe so. hmm That was not. That's not a that was never something that sat easily with me. I wasn't a popular kid, but I wasn't an outcast either, and I did experience, uh, I guess, a lot of racial bullying as a kid. So there was that factor. There was something about not quite fitting in perfectly, perhaps. But I think that what probably made me more comfortable standing up to authority was an experience just over the years of my childhood public school education. I think that now, if you could go back and, with today's lens, look at a kid like me, they would have labeled me ADD or ADHD. And I really struggled with paying attention. I really, really struggled with that, starting at around third or fourth grade. And I'm not exactly sure why it started so suddenly. I also got a mouthful of mercury fillings about that time. And I've wondered if maybe something about that exposure caused some kind of neurological damage. Who knows what it was? I don't know what it was. Maybe it's just my personality developing over time. But I started to have a lot of trouble focusing, and it was treated by my school in two ways. One, they put me in counseling, so I started seeing a therapist every week. And two, they treated it as a discipline problem, so I was always on some sort of suspension or academic probation. And it felt very unfair to me. I was really frustrated with the way that I was being handled. And I mean, I could go on about this. It's kind of a long story, it might be kind of boring, but um, I felt so frustrated by that experience and by other experiences that I was having at school, and by the bullying that was being completely overlooked and that sometimes teachers were engaging in, that I developed a chip on my shoulder about authority. And I guess that's always been a strong part of my personality ever since.
I'm nodding because, in my own ways, I can relate, but I also think it just makes so much sense that when a person isn't listened to for so long, and also maybe some of what they're suggesting about their experience of the world around them ends up being correct, or definitely valuable in the long run. It's natural to develop a chip on your shoulder and then kind of carry that through future experiences. And going back to the experience of being canceled, not all people who speak their conscience or, um, speak up or do something that is an act of dissidence necessarily get canceled. So, what do you think sets apart the circumstances that, maybe in a way are very similar, from the person that gets canceled and the person that doesn't?
Well, I think that if you are, say, you're experiencing um, this sort of radical ideology that we've seen so much of, that's a big part of what's causing people to speak up right now about disagreement with institutions that they work in or being educated in, or maybe it's COVID, some of these authoritarian policies that we've seen over the last 10 years, 5, 10 years. um, if someone is unhappy with what they're seeing around them and they're frustrated with what they're asked to go along with, there's going to be an internal conflict. And you can choose to keep that internal, or you can externalize that conflict and actually say no to the people that you feel are pressing this on you. And so I think that when that internal conflict becomes unbearable for someone, they will speak up and resist actively. And when you said earlier that you think that there's a values basis for this, I think that that's probably got something to do with it, because to the degree that you're internally conflicted, it probably has a lot to do with how strongly held whatever value is for you. So, for instance, with the masking that people were doing around COVID, and I don't know where anybody who's listening to this or even you fell on this, but for me, I felt like it was really irrational. I read the literature and the data on these masks, and I thought, this is just silly. Well, perhaps if I'm actively sneezing, I might there might be some utility in this because it's going to stop me from spewing all over everything, but just breathing and walking around doesn't make any sense. Plus, you can see that half the people who wear them pull them down so they can talk and then put them back. So it's just it felt like a very silly charade. And I felt it would have caused me such an internal conflict to put one of those on that I couldn't do that. So I'd rather have that conflict be external. I'd rather have that conflict with the people who are expecting me to do that than violate my own conscience and put that on my face. But other people felt like, it's silly, but it makes things go smoother. I don't want to have a fight. I don't want to have an argument with people. I'm more conflict averse than I am concerned about doing this. It's not really triggering anything for me to do this. So I'm just going to go along with it because I'd rather have peace than have a fight about it. So it's kind of like, are you more able to manage the internal conflict? And so you'd like to keep it there? Or are you more comfortable entering into the external conflict and you'd like to externalize this issue?
Or do not have conflict at all.
Right. Well, that's the whole other category. Yeah.
And maybe you don't, like you said, maybe the person has discomfort with it or just kind of rolls their eyes, but that's not really much of a conflict, as it is like a mild discomfort. But the duality of the question you were asking is, essentially, do you keep the conflict inside? Do you internalize it or do you externalize it? And I've noticed that when a person externalizes a conflict, then it can seem like maybe it is actually like it is starting a conflict. Would you say that like externalizing an inner conflict is effectively starting a conflict, or could the conflict already have been there externally in the first place?
I think it really depends on the situation. That's really, I I can probably imagine scenarios that would validate that in different ways, one way or the other. Uh, do you have a specific example?
Yeah, let's continue with the masks. So, I was adamantly like, I guess, pro-choice about the vaccines. I was pro-choice about the masks too, but for me, that was a little bit more of like yeah, I guess, and I'll still, I'm mostly not a fan of the masks, but um, it didn't bother me, which is a mild way of putting it. It didn't bother me as much as the vaccine mandates. And I think I know why, because the mask goes on your body. The vaccine goes in your body. So the mask, it, it it's it's a more subtle form of um, violating bodily autonomy. But I think what really constitutes a violation of bodily autonomy in my eyes is if the government or some other person forces you to put something in. Um, I'm sure you can think of even what one might say a worse example of that, but focusing on the vaccine mandates, that's how I saw it. And it was just adamantly a no. Like this violates such a deep care and value of mine. I did not really like. I could understand the perspectives. I could understand the fear. I could understand how the mass formation came to be. I could even understand the rationalization of why you should get it. I didn't. And yeah, upon reflection, I think it was the correct decision. Um, but it's not so much about correct and incorrect as it was authentic. We're supposed to be listening to our doctors, and my own medical doctor didn't get the vaccine herself. Why would I play on this stage, where everyone's touting this nonsense, and saying, well, you have to get your vaccine, you have to wear your mask because your doctor says so. And I'm like, that my doctor doesn't say that. So it violated a core belief I have around bodily autonomy, which I think I'm realizing in other areas of discourse that I think I have a somewhat different or maybe more specific care for the bodily autonomy that involves your body kind of as a temple and what you put in, whether it's food, whether it's tea, whether it's medicine, whether it's a vaccine. But if something is being taken out even or being put on top, I don't have as much of an irritation. I don't experience as much of an irritation about that. Um, I'm not sure if that answered your question. But
Yeah, it's a good example. I think that your question was if someone has an internal conflict around something and then and then turns that into an external conflict with someone else, was the conflict already there, or are they the ones starting the conflict? And I would say that with this example, the problem that I had with all of the above, with the masks and the vaccine as well, was that the conflict existed already. The conflict was with logic. We could hear the logical conflict. I mean, I worked at the time in a primary care clinic when COVID started, and for years I had worked in the medical field wearing these little blue masks anytime I came to work with a cold. If I was getting over a sniffle, if I still had a lingering cough, I would grab a mask and I would wear it. And I knew that what I was mostly, it was really two or three things. I was wearing it, one, to cover my any sneezy, spray, drippy stuff so that I'm not touching my face while I'm on the keyboard or whatever, spreading it to whoever's going to use that next. Two, it was to show the patients who would be sitting in the waiting room, who could probably hear from my stuffy nose and my voice and the occasional cough, that I wasn't in tip top shape, that I'm doing something to guard against spreading whatever I've got. So it's sort of like a symbol of communication and also a barrier for my hands to touch my like nasal secretions or whatever I've got. So it's just a hygiene thing and also a comfort thing for the people around me. But we knew right away that an asymptomatic person and the size of these viral particles, that there was no logic in making everybody wear these things. And so the conflict was with logic. It was with, like, also, you're going to demand that everybody cover their face, but you don't care if they've had that face covering in their pocket or in their car or where it's been. So there's no logical consistency to this project. It is simply an act of symbolism. It takes only that second piece into consideration, that second factor, I suppose, into consideration. And it's just in order to comfort everybody and make it look as if we are trying to do something. And I wanted to trust the medical industry, the public health authorities. I wanted to trust them more than to have them tell us that we must do something, that something was an absolute requirement, when the entire basis of that requirement was for show. I wanted to believe that they were better than that. And so my conflict was raising the issue of logic here. So the conflict existed outside, and I would say in that case, for me to say, okay, well, I see the logical inconsistency, the rhetorical fallacy of what you're asking me to do, but I'm going to go ahead and go along with it. That really hurt me. I couldn't violate my own conscience that way. I needed to say, no, I'm not going along with the charade. So I don't know if that answers the question.
yeah, I think you and I are actually more alike on that topic than maybe it seemed. The vaccine mandates, I think, maybe hit me a little harder, but the conflict with logic and the conflict with, I think, avoidance itself, like people avoiding how irrational it was, how unkind people came to be too, with each other, simply for just having differing opinions, even among medical folks. I think avoiding the conflict, or any avoidance of the conflict, could then spur internal conflict. I've heard people say that they felt like they didn't have a choice. But, parenthetically, they didn't have a choice but to stand up for individual liberties. And what a paradox that is, right? Because, at times it doesn't really feel like, in a way, a freedom. It feels like there's something inside of you that's compelling you to not internalize the conflict, but rather, if the only other way to qualify that is externalize the conflict, that's the choice that some of us make. And my understanding is that some people feel like they have to.
Mm. Yeah, I think that I can hear what you're saying. I always felt like I had a choice. I've never felt like I didn't have a choice. It's been an agonizing decision at times. Like when I decided to publicly start pushing back against what was going on in my graduate school, that took me, I don't know, 6 months to decide to do. It was a long process. It was a really difficult thing. It was nerve wracking. I was terrified about it. I had a choice. I also had a choice to sign their pledge and keep doing my training despite disagreeing with it, and I agonized over that too. So it was a really difficult choice. It wasn't a compulsion. It was a judgment call based on just intense deliberation and emotional turmoil. And it was really the same with the masks too. I mean, I'm making it sound really flippant, but it wasn't flippant for me. It was terrifying. I can remember sitting in my car, looking at a grocery store, scared out of my wits to go into that grocery store because I knew that I was going to be stared at, that I was going to possibly be yelled at, and I did get yelled at a few times, and that I was going to make people feel bad. And I didn't want to make some little old lady who was scared feel scared because I was there. And I would sit there and fight with myself about this, but I, it was more important to me to remain internally consistent and consistent with my own belief that this was illogical, and that if I were to continue to conform with it, I would be representing it as if it were true. And so I would be telling a lie, and I would be abetting a lie if I were to go along with something that I felt was false. And I, it's not that I couldn't do that; it's that I wouldn't do that.
You wouldn't. Mm. And I think when you're experiencing a conflict with logic, it in a way it's easier. It's a natural route to rationalize your decision, and when reason itself has been turned on its head, maybe that kind of feels like, well, I don't like, what else am I going to do? I can't just represent a lie or a complete inversion of truth. But essentially, yes. I mean, everything is a choice. And then there's the choice of, or maybe the understanding of why you might be performing an act of dissidence. What is your intention? And I consider, like, is it one's intention to simply just represent what they believe? Is it their intention to inspire people who feel similarly to do the same? Is their intention even trying to reach people who disagree with them and kind of have a change the world mentality about performing an act of dissidence? But what were your intentions, and how did they form when you performed your acts of blowing the whistle at Antioch and not wearing a mask?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that first, to assess whether something is right or wrong, if you're really struggling with something, I think that Immanuel Kant's The Categorical Imperative is very useful. Like, think about this act that you could do or not do. If everybody were to act as you would act, would that result in a net good or a net bad? How would that end up looking if everybody were to do? So if you're trying to decide if you should do something or not, this is a useful way to zoom out and get a different perspective. But for me, I guess in those particular acts, so not choosing not to wear a mask, I guess was the intention. The intention, first and foremost, was just not to lie, not to be dishonest. And I felt like I was being dishonest, again, if I were to comply with something which I knew was just for appearances. And I didn't agree with the appearance. I don't agree with the idea that I'm healthy, but in an abundance of caution, I'm going to just extra cover myself. Um, Another thing that I really took offense to, or really had a huge problem with, was the sort of the narrow sightedness of some of these COVID restrictions, which really limited it was like you're just taking one variable and you're going to manipulate that one variable as if it exists in a vacuum, and it's not going to trigger all kinds of other problems. Like I have I have hearing loss. I have enough hearing loss that I could wear a hearing aid. I don't. I'm kind of like on that line, but I rely on looking at people's mouths when they talk in order to really understand what is being said. I stare at people's mouths. I mean, when I first met my husband in person, he's like, "You're really looking at are you looking at my teeth?" And I'm like, "No, I'm trying to read your lips because I really need to see that in order to hear you." And so it was very frustrating to think that, and I'm mild in hearing loss, but there are lots of people out there who have really severe hearing loss. And this cut off a ton of communication just for an appearance, just for the appearance of something. So that felt like it was not just a lie, but a harmful lie. I guess another intention was, if I went into the store and I'm smiling at people and I'm not wearing it, well, there might be somebody else who feels like I do and is sitting in their car scared too, and they're falling just on the other side of that same decision. So their decision is just a little, just a hair to the right or the left of my decision, and so they put it on and they went in. But maybe if they see somebody else just shopping like it's a normal day and not doing it, they might feel like next time they could not do that. So I might encourage other people to tell the truth by an act of truth. And then with the graduate school, it was a totally different. Well, was it totally different? It was, perhaps some of the some similar, now that I think about it, principles at play. It felt like I was lying if I went along with the anti-white, uh, racial teachings that we were having, and I professed my own white privilege and talk about things in these kind of ways, these sort of packaged ways that they were having us, coaching us to do, or um, talk about the trans child, and speak about these things and degender everything, and support neopronouns and all these things that I didn't support. I didn't want to talk like this, and to say that Trump supporters are evil and irredeemable. I wasn't prepared to do those things. And so I guess by talking about it publicly, I hope that other people would hear me doing that and feel like, okay, she thinks like I think. Maybe I should say something too. Maybe I should also say, no, I don't agree with this. And by demonstrating that you can speak frankly without fear of repercussions and just act honestly without fear of repercussions might help other people to do similarly if they feel the way you do about it.
Were you hearing from people behind the scenes who felt similarly to you?
Well, with graduate school, you mean specifically? So when I was in school at the Seattle campus before everything went online, or before I started taking online classes, there were a number of people who thanked me or talked about it outside of class, but wouldn't say things in class. So yeah, there was even somebody who found me like 2 semesters after this one class that was really difficult, and approached me in the break room, the little lunchroom we had there, and said, "Thank you so much for some of the things that you said." And I felt a mix of frustration with these people. In fact, at one point, I felt really angry with some of these people because I knew that they agreed with me, and they let me get really bullied by the teacher in the class. The teacher actually started to cry because I asked some fairly innocuous questions, and cried about her emotional labor and how difficult this was. And you know, I felt really angry at these people for agreeing and staying silent. But I also felt like, uh, on the other hand, a little bit of optimism, because it shattered the illusion that there was a like a monolithic, everybody agrees, everybody's on board, and then there's me standing by myself. I knew that that wasn't true. I knew that there were a fair number of people who were questioning this stuff, and at least feeling like they agreed more with my skeptical position than with the ideology that we were being taught. So that gave me cause for optimism.
Mm. Optimism, but not fulfilling at least the hope, if not perhaps the intention that others would feel inspired to speak up as well. Um, in some ways, it can be more frustrating, to hear that people actually agree with you, but they won't join you or even just in a small way advocate for you. Um, I'm remembering the slogan, it's not enough to be racist, you must be anti-racist. And I think there's a there's a hermetic principle that opposites mirror each other, and I mean that's not just hermetic, but I think many can see that. And when one is adamant that like you must be anti this, you must say something, you must do something exactly how I want you to say it and do it. I think that can be a form of the opposition, or in a way the same, just showing up in a perhaps a different value system. But it's hard. It's hard, when you're getting pummeled, you're getting canceled, or simply just having even a conflict in one's personal life and with family, for instance, to not naturally feel some resentment for the people who agree with you but aren't being anti-racist or like anti the conflict. I mean, I suppose in a way it humanizes the so-called opposition, to understand like that's human nature, and we can all succumb to those ways of being. Um, but I'm not really sure what I mean, obviously none of us are sure what the solution is, or even a solution is to a lot of this, to the racial hostility, to the confusion over gender and so forth. But mainly it's just the mistreatment of people and the dehumanizing of people and setting people apart as if some stories are worth more than others, worth listening to more than others. And this brings me to the part of the process of, okay, you performed an act of dissidence, perhaps you've begun creating a community, which I know you and my friend Jody Shaw have. Then what? What brings people together is, yeah, we've all performed acts of dissidence, but what values bring you together? What values make a lasting community?
Mm. Yeah, that's a good question too. And I think I want to, before I answer that, just going back to what you said or what we were talking about the kind of the bystander who agrees but stays silent. For me, the only time I really resented that was when I was in the crosshairs, when I was experiencing basically verbal attack, verbal abuse, psychological abuse, certainly in a group setting. And I was surrounded by people, several of whom I knew could have said a word in my defense and didn't. But in terms of expecting other people to follow suit, I don't. I've never been. I've never been keen on that. Like I know that there was this we had a discussion, I think, on one of our solid ground groups or on one of the live streams a few months back. I think it was Peter Boghossian who had made a statement that was kind of like, for all of you coming over and joining our side or whatever now, where were you when we were experiencing this, that, and the other? It was this, and I can understand that expression of anger. I don't mean to call him out for his expression of frustration and anger, because that's a really relatable feeling. But I also feel like it just takes some people longer. And maybe people are all on their own trajectory. And I think about that, going back to like that moment sitting in the car. That's a great place to just sort of epitomizes this experience for me. And I had this I had friends who agreed with me. This is, speaking of community, this kind of segues into that, because we built a very strong in-person community during COVID here as well. And So I had a lot of people around me in my circle who agreed with my perspective and who had a real intolerance for the other people. So you'd hear words like sheep thrown around. You'd hear like these sheep or just whatever. And I could share their frustration, and I sometimes express some of the same things, but I I really tried to keep in mind that the sheep is the person who goes along with it either blindly, trustingly, or the one that they're really mad at, the one that the dissidents are really mad at, is the one who believes what you believe but doesn't stand for their beliefs and goes along with what's easy and conforms. And that person, I have a lot of compassion for that person, because they're probably the person who sits in their car feeling the same way, but then doesn't have the guts for whatever reason, for lots of reasons: temperament, background, experiences, fear of rejection. People have lots of different levels of what's your level of agreeableness and your need to be liked by other people. So I I don't fault people for not being able to take that leap, because it's an individual choice. But in terms of building community, um, we built a really great community when the lockdown happened. I knew a couple of other moms that also homeschooled their kids, and I was a very reluctant homeschooler at that point. I did not want to homeschool. My ex-husband had sort of talked me into it, wrangled me into it, and we were going. I was on a 1 year at a time sort of thing. Like, any next year I'm going to put these kids in school. Next year I'm going to put them in school. And then the lockdowns happened and school went all online, and they sent even the youngest kids home with laptops, which seemed absolutely crazy to me. And I thought, there's no way I'm putting my kids in there. And I knew a couple of other moms. And so we decided, we're not afraid of this thing. We see this as a giant scam of some kind. We're not worried about COVID. We think it's alarmist. And we started meeting every single week with our kids. So you could call it a pod if you want, but it was really just our families getting together and meeting. And then we grew that until we had this really fantastic community. We had a gathering at one point in like 2022, early that year, that had like 80 people at it. It was really lovely. And we've stayed connected. The whole community has really stayed connected, and people are still supporting each other's businesses. And then with Solid Ground, which is the online community that we formed for, after Counterweight dissolved their peer support arm, it was Jody Shaw, myself, Jennifer Friend, and David Simpson, and Deborah Knox. We've created this online group where people can share and talk. And I think that you know, the value is connection. That's the real prize of that kind of thing. It starts with, we have a problem, but the problem essentially is a problem of disconnection. And I think that when you're asked to tell a lie, when you're lied to and you're told that it's truth, and you feel like you don't know how to talk to the people who are saying this to you, and you're punished for speaking what you think is true, you can feel really alienated and lonely and confused and disoriented. And the value of these kinds of communities is that you're among people who are trying also to live in truth, and to really value the honest and authentic connection that comes when you're speaking openly and truthfully. And so that's something that I think that it's a form of, I mean, it's a value of a certain form of communication that can adjust with time, and be used for a variety of different substantial conversations, or light conversations or connections. But really the value is human connection.
Human connection, and the antithesis of that being disconnection. I've heard that disconnection is actually what causes people to shoot up schools. There was an activity that a teacher did that was going viral on social media, which I won't get into the details of the activity, but essentially what the lesson was that children need to feel connected to one another in class, to fulfill the basic need for safety, let alone community and happiness and learning, but just safety. You need a connected group of children. You need everyone, especially the one who might feel left out, to feel a part of something and to feel even loved, feel that they have friends. Um, and over the past few years, of course, some have found themselves in this group, or maybe haven't even found communities where they can find connection, they can find relatable experiences, and that leaves some people like, yeah, I guess brewing, in their feelings of naturally of resentment and disconnection. And I think that's something to really keep an eye on, because we're all only human, and we all have our triggers. Sometimes those triggers or those motivators trigger us uh, to speak up in a really beautiful way, or perform a beautiful act that's aligned with our values. And sometimes uh, those pain points can lead to destructive acts. Um, and when creating such a community, I think it's also helpful for me, as well, to like keep in mind that the pendulum swings. The minority opinions at times do become the majority opinions, and this actually brings to mind an experience I had with an old friend who's a librarian at a college. And I caught up with her shortly after I started the series, and she was curious, like, what I was doing. And so I just mentioned, I had started a series called Leaving the Left for Liberty. It's not meant to be political. It's just to create a community of people with, offbeat ideas and acts, I guess. But anyway, I was very hesitant to tell her. And she actually responded so positively and with so much curiosity, because she said, "Yeah, I mean, I don't feel like I'm part of the left anymore either, because my community of colleagues over there at the college, they don't let me teach critical race theory anymore. They don't let me, bring in certain books." And I'm like, my mind, well, this wasn't just after I started the series. I think it was well after. But I think for me, it still felt fresh. I was like, well, surely, things are still, rough out there for those of us who oppose CRT and other belief systems and ways of teaching. And to hear her say, without really obviously looking into the show, to hear her say, "Yeah, I'm really glad that you're doing what you're doing," it put it into perspective for me that actually on CRT we might be in the majority opinion now.
Oh my gosh, that's really interesting. So you saw her middle point was different than your middle point.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I do wonder if her middle point was more accurate than mine, because she's actually in higher education. And of course, every university and college is different. But I found that so interesting. It actually kind of a relief just in the moment socially, because I was like, oh, okay, well, she doesn't really understand me at all. But at least, at least she's not mad at me for the overview of what I just said.
Yeah, that's a really interesting experience.
And I think beyond just ideas and even like connection on an intellectual level, an emotional level too, what sustains that is bonding activities, and a mission. Like where are we going? What is our, not endpoint, but what is our intention? Perhaps we had our intentions in speaking up and homeschooling and um, embodying certain acts or approaches that were contrary to the popular opinion or the prevailing theories. But now what? Okay, so we build our connections. We have these warm and fuzzy feelings. We're not alone. What's a mission that we can work towards? What's a mission that you work towards with your in-person community and with your online community in solid ground?
I don't think that I have. I think I'm kind of, don't believe I have a mission necessarily, unless you just count staying connected, connecting people, having open explorations of our thoughts and our experiences. And uh, I I have, I suppose, I named the YouTube channel the Radical Center ironically. It's meant to be an ironic name because it shouldn't be radical to be in the center, and I was finding myself feeling as if I were. Um, but I've kind of resist. I really want to. I try to actively. examine anytime I find myself part of what feels like narrative and counter narrative. And so, we're never going to vanquish the enemies. There are always going to be new things to fight. There's always going to be new things that cause discontent. If we could take ourselves and transport ourselves back to any point in the human timeline, there would be a crisis and an enemy and something to battle and something to be opposed to. And I think that's just part of the process of life. And so to me, it's more, I don't have some kind of like, I want to get CRT out of school, or I want to whatever. I I see a need for balance, and I think balance is it's never fully maintained. It's always something that you're trying to achieve. You're coming in and out of balance. And I think that the way to work towards balance is through nuance and through looking at the gray areas. And so having a missionary zeal on this side of an issue because that side is going too far just creates a pendulum swing. It just increases this momentum, this back and forth momentum. And I am much more interested in things that can be in just being in a state of connection and flow. And it's going to be this whole human experience is sort of a never-ending examination of ourselves and creation of new problems to examine in new ways. And it's a very awkward and fascinating thing, being a human being. But I think connection and conversation and nuanced discussion and examination is kind of my goal.
Perhaps another way of stating mission is creation. What are you creating, and what comes out of a creative flow is at times a mystery. We don't know what's going to come out of it, but you have to form the community first and find out. Form the connection even with yourself first and find out. And that's a very creative way, artistic way of being.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. Yeah. And I think that I am an individualist in that I think that the autonomy and the power of examination and creation belongs with each individual. But I'm not an absolute individualist in that I don't think that it's fair to even define people as finite, separate little entities, because we're all so richly interconnected with one another in interesting ways. It's a web of interconnection. So what comes out of a community is it's more and more possibility, I suppose.
What comes out of nuance leads me to think what comes out of nuanced relationships and friendships in light of some of what's happened in the first few years of the 2020s. How do we lean into connections that how do we lean into a connection with a new friend or an old friend who did not have the same experience of the early 2020s as we did. They did not perform an act of distance. They didn't say a darn thing or do a darn thing outside of the current narrative. Or maybe it's only in recent months that they've changed their minds on things. What value do you see in forming friendships or rekindling friendships like that?
I think there's a lot of value in that. I do. I think that it's so easy to judge other people. It's really, really easy to stand outside of somebody else and make a judgment about what made them do this or that. And you might be right or you might not, but I think sometimes it comes down to what was the value of that friendship to you? Was that a family member? Was it a close friend? Are you trying to repair something? And maybe ask yourself, would I rather be right or would I rather be connected? And is this the hill I want to die on? And And do we have more in common? Could we build something together that matters more than the things that we don't have in common? I think that there's people are very quick right now to divorce family members, to cut themselves off from family members. And I think that in some really extreme circumstances, perhaps that's the best thing you can do. But in many circumstances, it's you're really just avoiding the conflict. And maybe you don't need to have a conflict. Maybe there's a reason why religion and politics and money and sex were things that we didn't used to talk about with most people, because they're really contentious. And now all this political contention is just on the outside all the time, and people are tearing their hair out and fighting with each other about these things.
They are. I think in the extreme circumstances, I see often there are threats or condonings of violence, or close enough sort of actions or words that uh, even just for safety purposes, going back to connection versus disconnection in the classroom, even among kids, like there are certain things that are said, and if they're not remedied or apologized for, I'm not sure there's really going back, unless you want to kind of risk your life. um,
Threatening to hurt you, then maybe you shouldn't be close to them. But if it's something that somebody said once that seemed extreme, I I think that ideally there's some sort of path to redemption, depending on whether it's maybe you don't want to forgive an individual. Maybe bridges are burned, and that happens in life. Maybe sometimes too much has been done. But in if we're going to work to bring back the gray area, bring back the center, come back from the polarized opposites, then there has to be forgiveness and there has to be a path to redemption. You can't have this, you're either with us or against us, be the way that you operate with other people. And I think that one of the, like within families, for instance, this is something that I see with people that I work with. Say a child has a trans identity, and the parents or the parent think that this is not right. They don't want to affirm this. There can be a real conflict there between the parent and the child. The parent says, no, you're not, I'm not going to call you by this boy's name or this girl's name or these other pronouns. And so the child says, well, then you're a transphobe and you're denying my existence. And so you have this like really hard line that these families will draw with each other. And the parent can't communicate with the child because there's just a shut off on both sides. And what I think ideally you want to see is you want to have both sides put away the argument that they're having and focus on something else that can grow their connection. Like, is there some way that even just like once a day you can sit down and have a conversation that has nothing to do with this conflict? And so you start to build and grow the things that you do have in common, or even develop new things that you have in common, so that hopefully eventually you can come alongside of each other and that conflict isn't the centerpiece of your whole relationship. And it's through that maybe you can start to see each other and humanize, and maybe the child will start to take the influence from the parents a little bit better because the parents aren't on the other side. And you can work towards acceptance of one another as people.
Right. What I was taking away from that is that if the child has an environment where their gender confusion isn't their whole identity, and the parent has or is creating an environment where their opposition to that isn't the full identity, then there's a space, that's available, for something else and a deeper, and in a way irrelevant connection.
Yeah, I think that's really, really well said. And I think that we do tend to take, if you apply force, you get resistance. But you're much more likely to want to take influence from someone that you like and that cares about you and that you have other things in common with. And so if there's something really important that you want to communicate to a friend, to a loved one, and you think, I wish that they would see it this way because I think the way that they're seeing it is wrong. Rather than trying to force your opinion and demand that they conform to it, you can work on the friendship, and through friendship have opportunities for dialogue, and you have a much better chance of having that person listen to you and take your perspective seriously.
Mm. Well said as well. Thank you, Leslie. It was a pleasure having you on again. And I just want you to know I really value your approach and your insights on the psychology of dissident acts and co-creating community.
Well, thank you so much, Sienna. It's a pleasure to speak with you.